We're in business to save the planet, and we use making clothes to do that. The cure for depression is action. Every one of us has to step up and do what you can according to what your resources are.
All right, how's it going? That was the voice of Patagonia's Yvonne Chenard, and this is Type 2, a podcast from Looking Sideways in association with Patagonia that explores the intersection between outdoors, action sports and activism. In each show, I've been meeting people who are using their passion and involvement with the cultures we all love to create change. We've been discussing the issues they're involved in, the change they're seeking to create, the difficulties involved and the rewards that follow. You can find each episode on all the usual podcast platforms. Wherever you're listening, make sure you hit subscribe so you can get each episode as it's released. Now, my guest this week is the great Len Necefer. Well, Dr. Len, to be precise. Len's a professor at the University of Arizona. He's CEO of Natives Outdoors, a board member at the Honnold Foundation and also the American Alpine Club. Yep, he's pretty busy, Len, and it's a breadth of experience that's given him a very intriguing and insightful approach to activism and an intersectional take on the issues we currently face. Len is of mixed Navajo and European heritage, and his work is primarily focused, as the bio for Natives Outdoors puts it, on empowering native and indigenous communities for a sustainable world. Through his work and various outlets, Len is helping to bridge the gap that exists between the indigenous take on the outdoors and that classic white Western approach we're all very used to, which after all can come with attendant colonial connotations, let's just put it that way. From speaking to Len, I think it's important to realise he's a consensus builder, someone who's concerned with inclusivity and opening doors rather than enforcing entrenched positions. For Len, humour is a tool and dogmatism, whatever your political leaning, is to be avoided. I mean, take a look at his singular Instagram account, through which he uses some frankly exemplary meme skills to explore these issues for proof of that. Really, really enjoyed this one. Len is a warm, thoughtful and very, very interesting character. He's got a lot of original thinking on this topic. And yeah, very much enjoyed it. I'll be back at the end. But in the meantime, here's me and Len. Enjoy. So is that you done then?
Done. Yeah, it's like for at least for a few weeks. And then the insanity starts again. But yeah, I'm a professor in my day job, so that's why. Yeah.
So what's the plan? What are you going to do?
Well, if the snow ever comes, I'm going to go north to Colorado and try to relearn how to ski like I do every season. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, I know that. Feels, God, snowboarding, that feels like it's probably quite far away for me.
Really?
Be interesting. It'd be interesting to see how that goes again. Yeah, I actually watched your episode of the 50 the other day with Cody.
Oh, right on. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like that show. I've sort of weirdly become addicted to that show. It's very good lockdown viewing. Just bang one of those on for 20 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a fun one. It totally came up by chance, and Cody emailed me to my work email, my professor email, and I said, this is bizarre. But he reached out about wanting to ski this particular line, and I've looked at it before outside of Moab. It's just a phenomenal peak, it just sits out in the middle of the desert. But we had just brought on a new athlete, Connor, who you saw.
Yeah.
And I kind of told him, it's like, hey, Cody wants to go ski a thing in Moab. I didn't really tell him what we were doing because I didn't want it to get in his head. So
right.
He shows up and he's like, what's this camera for? And I'm like, well, we're doing an episode of the 50. And he's like, why didn't you tell me?
threw him in there. Threw him in the deep end.
Threw him in there. It totally threw him in the deep end.
It looked like it was in the middle of, that range doesn't look like the rest of the peaks that he's doing in that mission, whereas they're in the middle of the Tetons, the Rockies. It looked like it was kind of basically quite standalone. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It's There's a couple range. This is southeastern Utah, near the Four Corners of the United States. There's, when you're on top of the peak, you can see the Colorado Rocky Mountains.
Right.
And they're just, about an hour's drive away. But that particular peak, they're pretty much the only thing standing out there. And they literally rise out of the Red Rock Desert. So you saw that shot where, looking down and you just see that red rock expanse. And
it looks amazing.
It's amazing.
Really, really beautiful. Yeah. And
the skiing was, not particularly hard, but I think what makes that a classic line is that mountain, the view, and just kind of like it just seems impossible to be skiing in the desert like that.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I really like about that show. The fact that the skiing is often really not great. It's proper type 2 fun, isn't it? And but that's all sort of almost part of the charm of it, really, like the adventure of it. Yeah,
right.
It's great. So you mentioned you said we just took on an athlete. So is that through Native Outdoors?
Yeah, that is. Yeah, so that was Connor and Connery, whatever his name was in the film.
Yeah. So basically you've got, apart from the memes, which I'm sure we'll get to, you've got two things going on. You've got your day job, as you mentioned. You're at University of Arizona, is that right?
That's right. Yep.
And then you're behind Native Outdoors as well.
That's right. Yeah.
And then it looks like you're also super busy with things like the Honnold Foundation and lots of other. It seems like you got a lot of different irons in the fire, let's say.
Oh yeah. So I'm on the board for the American Alpine Club and the Honnold Foundation. So that's been great, but yeah, it's busy. Definitely lots of structured and scheduling. But I think at the end of the day, like a lot of the work overlaps and serves each other. So, I'm simply just trying to create more opportunity for Native folks in the outdoor industry. And so the company is one way to do that. The other is on the education side, teaching about natural resource policy, recreation, and then the board work and very much is serving that as well. So there's a lot of overlap, I would say, in my work. So
right. So was the outdoors an interest that you had when you were a kid? Like, you grew up basically into this whole skiing, climbing. You do a lot of cycling as well, right? So
yeah.
Was this something that when you were growing up you were passionate about?
I would say the cycling was an interesting story. I was a very competitive golfer up until I was about 18. So I was,
oh, really?
I was cycling and golfing, and I was living in Kansas. My dad was a pretty big cyclist in his day. He rode from Seattle to Baja back in the mid 70s. So long ride. And, so he was keen on keeping me, at least teaching me how to ride from an early age. But he was a surfer for a good chunk of that early part of the 70s and lived in a van and did that. So, for him, I've taken a lot from him in the sense of just, always at the end of the day is get outside, play, spend some time outside. It's good for your head. And my mom, she's comes from a family in which we're traditional Navajo healers. And so, I spent a lot of time outside with my grandpa collecting herbs, planting, herding sheep, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of that was the synergy, is like I had those two threads come together. And so in the summers I'd be out west, with my family. And then when I was back in Kansas, we'd be riding bikes and doing that thing and golfing.
Right. Yeah, right. So that's definitely two different cultural lenses through which to experience the outdoors then, essentially.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, because I guess that's what I'm interested in, the way that you've kind of reconciled, you mentioned, that you want to use your platforms to explore the Native experience in the outdoors, and perhaps because obviously the way that most people experience the outdoors is through a pretty traditionally Western lens, isn't it, really? Mm-hmm. So at what point did you start to think that was something that you wanted to address?
I think it came in large part because I was pretty unhappy with the job I had at the time. So the Instagram, Natives Outdoors originally started as an Instagram account. It's since evolved into, we do media work, we do product, we do some consulting. But I remember I was sitting in a conference in some Las Vegas casino with a bunch of other government folks. I was working with the Department of Energy at the time, and I was wearing a suit. I just kind of was thinking, man, I wish I could go out to Red Rocks right now. But I'm gonna be stuck here all day. And I kept thinking there has to be a way to do something different. So that was part of it, and the other part of it, I was living in Colorado, and I was climbing. I was learning how to ski at that point, and I don't know. I had to have these conversations with my family and community about what I was doing, because so much of the sports I was doing was unrelatable, and I got the feedback of folks saying like, "Well, that's what white people do," and I was like, "Well, I'm doing it, and I'm not, I'm native, so there's a disconnect." But I saw it as an opportunity to build community. I knew that there was other people out there doing that. I'm pretty sure that they were on their own islands as well, and so I created that initially just to share stories and photos, and then what we began seeing is that there was an increasing conversation to diversify the outdoors, and then there's some stuff around cultural appropriation in this country, and so we kind of took a dive into that, and it's I don't know, at the end of the day, we're just kind of doing our thing, sharing the stories, and if folks want to join along, that's totally cool. So
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that the idea that it's activities for a particular demographic or people from a cultural background, but it is a real thing, isn't it? Like it is basically, if you are, I mean, it's the same in this country. Like we've had a debate in this country quite recently this year, because there was a report that was brought out which basically said that there needed to be more encouragement for people from a non-white background to experience the outdoors, to experience like the national parks, and the backlash was from people that are very comfortable in that environment. Essentially white people was vociferous. It was like, this isn't real. You're like putting identity politics in this area. Like the outdoors is open for everybody, and and it seemed, I was very surprised at that kind of response, because it kind of seems self-evident that they are predominantly, I mean, I'm just talking about my experience in this country, they are predominantly pretty white activities. And it sounds like there's something quite similar from what from what you said, that some of your family members were saying, like, well, almost essentially that's just not what we do, kind of thing. So is it a similar situation over there, that it's seen as activities for certain people from a certain background and demographic, and that's part of what you're doing to try and change that, to make it more open to people from different backgrounds?
yeah, I would say it's kind of a two-way perception gap. I think I was telling Cody that that's probably the first native-centered ski film ever made, as far as I'm aware.
Which is wild, isn't it?
But part of that particular experience was just in bridging the gap with Cody's experience, because Cody's very well respected and well known, and for that particular trip we just gave him sort of our glasses, or for a day, and he got to see the world through our perspective, and at the end of the day, that's normalizing and sort of making our cultures relatable and more understandable to the broader user group is important, because at the end of the day, it makes our work a lot easier. But on the flip side of it, in our own communities, there's these activities have to fit within the cultures that we come from. And so, in a lot of Connor and I's work, so much of how we relate culturally, how we relate to mountains, is that they're very spiritual and important things. But in our practices, no one has really combined those two, or like created the sort of pathway for people to combine the cultural and spiritual elements of this with the sport. And, and I think in our own way, that's how we're engaging that conversations on both sides, and at least just trying to make it easier for both groups to like figure it out.
Is there also, because you mentioned, the traditional, I think you used the word spiritual, like way that you're the culturally, to be in that mountain environment. I guess what I was asking was in the West, like if you look at the the relatively recent history of alpinism, climbing, outdoor culture, it is like the language is language of conquest. Language is like challenging the outdoors, defeating the mountain. Is there a cultural gap to sort of address there as well, like in terms of those different approaches?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, just like the language of conquest is the easy way to trigger people in my community, at least in relating to the mountains. And so when I first,
of course,
when I first entered the space and like, climbing mountains and doing that thing, I adopted a lot of that language too, kind of unknowing, and then began evaluating evaluating that language as well. And part of that I almost felt was informed by just learning about the pre-contact mountaineering culture that existed before. There's one of our sacred peaks, which is the easternmost. It's called Cisnagini. The highest point in there is called Blanca Peak in English. But it's, 14,300 foot mountain and, massive prominence. And but the first sort of expedition up to like claim the first descent found a rock structure up top. So people were going up there before. Right. But yeah, I think that gave some perspective, at least in kind of giving me permission to do these things, because people were doing it before and people were interested, and even some of our ceremonial songs talk about climbing the mountain. So I just figured, there's a way in which we can adapt these things that we're doing and combine it with these sports now and make it relevant, and that's in large part just, I don't know, in the way of like kind of, I don't want to say talking back to the colonial and colonialism and conquest. I mean, because in many ways that's how people get their entry into getting in the outdoors, and I don't want to alienate people and like deny their experience, but I also want to like provide sort of a different way to see things, and people can make their own decision about how they choose to relate to them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's context, isn't it? Like that, the sort of that, I keep saying traditional, and I mean Western traditional, like, as like this kind of like outdoor tradition. Obviously it's just one way of doing it, and as you rightly say, a lot of it did come from colonialism. It did come from like it was very linked to, especially again like in my country, like those early expeditions, very very linked to like national identity, like the empire, colonialism. And equally in your country, there's I'm sure like a lot of like westward movement and exploration is quite a delicate subject, given the history and given like the way that directly affected native populations. So, but I totally understand what you're saying, because you can't, it's not about like right or wrong, is it? It's just about sort of contextualizing in a way that more people can find a way in, isn't it? Which, rather than saying like there's one way to do it, you've got to do it this way, and you can't do it in that Western way, you need to do it in this other way. And from looking at the work that you do, yeah, it seems like you're really good at striking that balance of like basically being inclusive, saying, like that there's more than one way, and that's fine, and it doesn't mean one way's right, one way's wrong. Is that a big, is that one of the ways that you purposely approach it?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think, I always have to reflect. You don't know what you don't know. And especially as an educator, you can't. I don't know. It like chastising people for ignorance is like the worst thing you can do for encouraging them to learn, and it's such an easy way to turn people off from like experiencing different worldviews. Part of that was I went to this international high school here in New Mexico called United World College. It actually started in England, but there's this funny photo of Prince Charles out in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, opening the school in like the early 80s, but that school was really formative for me, because there was 250 students from 94 countries. And so as a young person, this was something that I don't know. I mean, that sort of experience with diversity, at an early age, was such a powerful thing. And at least understanding that there's not right or wrong, but there's like so many ways to see the world. And I think it gave me a lot of respect for that. So in the work that I moving forward, I always try to approach, everyone that I work with and the context that I work with that understanding that like everyone's carrying their own story and their own perspective. And I think far too often what I've seen is just sort of, it's so easy just to categorize and just throw people in a box and for like, oh, they're white, they're native, and like their experiences are vastly different.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with that. I almost say, there's a lot more that ties us together than drives us apart, and what makes us different makes it interesting.
Yeah, I guess that can come from a misguided place, in a lot of ways, to try and categorize in that way, which is something else to be mindful of when you try to walk this territory, really, isn't it?
Yeah, really is.
I mean, I was really interested in that Instagram post that you put up actually the other day about you put up a post a couple of days ago about, being mindful of people that are using positions for their own personal gain. This like, I think the phrase like excess virtue signaling maybe was a phrase that you used.
Virtuous victimhood.
What was that? Where was that coming from? Yeah, right. That was the phrase. Yeah. Where was that coming from? Because that was a really interesting take on that.
Because one of the things I've been seeing, online is it's so easy there's a lot of, I would say a lot of influencers, both, from the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the white, that are taking these really strong moral stands on social issues, and in some ways also being incredibly toxic, and also not inclusive, and creating, I would say recreating sort of systems of power that almost feel like, I'm not Christian myself, but like I have a lot of family that are, but almost these systems of power of shame and guilt and things that like are not a part of me culturally, but almost feel like this extension of it. I think especially in this country, the discussion around race is really fraught right now. And I think there's a big strive for people to have purity within the movement. And so this sort of purifying process that people are going through is just, outwardly pretty toxic. And one of the ways in which I've seen that manifest is, people start demanding compensation for their time for posting, their Google searches about diversity on their stories. And I just, having been an academic myself, it's like, and also understanding that there's multiple ways to understand and do this work, and this might not be the best context. And like, if you're just posting your Google searches, then like, and then demanding payment from people, it's just like, I think one of the things that comes to mind is like, okay, what are the values at play here? Is that we're commodifying our time and interaction and our social interactions with each other. And I think one of the things that I see in that is it's given the stance that's being taken by some of the folks, they very much care about what they care about, but the one thing is that if you're going to critique capitalism and then commodify your own personal interactions with each other, like that is a value conflict. And the other is that I think it's almost, I think sometimes I get a little frustrated too, because there's a little bit of elitism about what's the proper language, and shaming people when they don't know. And I think broadly, when we look at how do we operate as a society, like elitism is not I disdain academia because of the elitism. And I think I see it in these power structures being recreated around language and ways of knowing and ways of doing things that are like striving for a purity that I just think is going to drive a lot of people away. Like at the end of the day, I think we have a big obligation to, as unfortunate as it is, like one of my roles is as a Native person is like I have a role to educate, and I'm going to do that in a way that's approachable. I'm going to do that in a way that's free, and that's going to yield greater benefits for my community. So in terms of that particular post, That's why I don't ask for money, and I don't, demand things of people. And if someone, writes me something that isn't like using the correct terminology or language, I'm not going to shame that. I'm going to meet that person where they're at and, have that conversation. And my hope from that is that maybe we both will take another step closer in the right direction. But I just think, I think what I've seen around this is that it's become its own sort of growth industry and economy, and I don't like it. I don't think diversity should be treated like that. So that's my moral stake in the ground.
Yeah, no, I found it really fascinating. It's why I bring it up, because like you say, you end up creating replacement power structures. Given and you're supposed to be about dismantling those power structures and those barriers. I do wonder if it is quite a tendency of the left in a lot of ways, and it is an interesting question, isn't it? Like the theme of this podcast is activism, and one of the other themes that comes through a lot from the conversations is this idea of the fact that if you're gonna actually change things, like whether you like it or not, you are going to have to appeal to people who aren't as knowledgeable or committed to the cause, whatever the cause might be, as you are. And if you police them to a ridiculous degree, like, that is alienating. That is gonna defeat the object of your purported goal, isn't it? So I think it's a really interesting point. I guess why I brought it up is because it was, I've not seen anyone call it out as you did quite so. That was really upfront, and also, like, interesting enough, you were citing like academic research around that, right? Like, and linking it to sort of traits of sort of narcissism and yeah, which was also kind of fascinating.
Well, I think I had a few people reach out to me. It's like, well, you're one of the few people that can say that without getting completely dragged, online. And I think, to speaking to what you're saying, like, my family politically is really interesting. Like, I have my dad's side my dad's like, Green Party, left as left that they can get. He's not super dogmatic about it, but I do have super conservative religious families, like folks, like I would say were Trumpers before Trump was even a thing. And I think what I've seen, broadly, is that, in terms of inspiring movements, you can do it by fear, you can do it by inspiring people. And, I think the thing by fear, I don't think it's long lasting. And especially now around race issues and inequality and all of that, I think, there's a lot of people that are scared of saying anything or having an opinion or saying anything that deviates from the norm. And I don't know how long you can maintain that that sort of coalition when you have folks internally that are just afraid about the social repercussions. And I've gone through a number of online call-outs myself, and they're toxic. They're just, I got a threat of violence I had to report to the police, and this was like around diversity stuff. I'm just like, this is crazy. This is not, we can't cannibalize ourselves and like try to do this for this movement. And I think at the end of the day, it's like, even when I began seeing folks kind of proclaiming, sort of righteousness and justice and like these things in a very like self-righteous way online, that's when a red flag goes up for me, because I saw my very, very conservative Baptist relatives do that, and their message was very different, but their conviction and belief in what they were saying was very much the same. And the way that played out was also very toxic. So, and personally, there's that sort of trigger, is that in any sort of group where there's a really strong belief set, you can get these sort of behaviors that are very toxic as well. And I think we have to name that and say, like, this is not the society I want to live in. And I don't want people to be afraid of trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, like, it's that you use the word fraught, and there is a change happening in your country right now. I mean, we're talking the day after, is it Deb Haaland just was named Secretary of the Interior, which is obviously like huge shift. And there is, obviously literal and metaphorical transition going on in the States right now. And there's going to have to be some kind of rapprochement, isn't there? There's going to have to be some kind of meeting in the middle. Like, it doesn't feel like it's sustainable, like the kind of enmity that's been shown on both sides. So yeah, it feels like that will be necessary, like the approach that you're talking about. Is that so? One of my questions on that subject would be, is that why you use humor quite a lot? Because obviously in your, I follow your Insta, and I mentioned the memes earlier. It's a lot of memes, a lot of gags, and it's great. Like, is that one of the approaches that is that a conscious thing to try and talk about those issues in a funny way, like in a way that kind of also sends up sometimes the ridiculousness of the discourse that you can see around these conversations? Yeah,
that's so yeah, definitely. And it was a very deliberate choice, like basically when the pandemic started, because if you look through my past posts, a lot of it's just outdoor stuff and talking about public lands or climate change and blah blah blah. And increasingly, I just saw the rhetoric and the sort of grandstanding around all of these issues just get turned up to 11, and then people were fighting, and I got sick of it, and I started posting memes in large part just to, just kind of break the tension around the initial lockdown, and people liked it. And I think part of it is because sometimes, depending on what, who you follow and, sort of what your crowd and scene looks like, it can be pretty stressful to be online. And, I've had to, and in many ways I'm just kind of having an outward channel and not really trying to take too much in. But, in part that comes from where I am as a Native person. In Navajo culture, we often use humor to diffuse tension, and we often use it in situations where it's really serious and really important topics being discussed. There will be laughing, and I think right now, especially around diversity issues, I've kind of noticed a lot of my white folks and white friends are just really nervous about saying anything, and even coming to me. Like they're like, there's a lot of hesitancy of like, no, they don't want to say the wrong thing and blah, blah, blah. And I just like, I don't like that. And I think for the group of folks that I try to support, and is just, I'm always a resource. I'm always willing to talk, and it's not going to be a judgmental space. But I think, adding to all of this, like I at the end of the day, I really see the value of building allies and folks that share our values and care about the things that we do, and or maybe just see the things that we do, and so that's what it's turned into. And I don't know how long I'll keep doing it, maybe until once everyone's vaccinated and we can get through this. But I think the thing is I remember seeing some report early on and saying like 1 in 4 people are experiencing depression, and that's crazy. So it's my small public service that is pretty dumb.
Yeah, I mean, but it is. I'm not gonna, effective is a bit of a dickish word to use about it, but because it makes it sound like like a tool for activism, as if it's like. But what I mean, though, it is helpful for people, I think, because like you say, if you are mindful of trying to be politically correct, like make sure you're being respectful, people can find it challenging, and people can feel like they might be causing offense or whatever. And I think like just some of it just is funny, like some of those human interactions can, like, there is humor in that, and that's a good thing to highlight. And I think people do find it helpful, which you can see, right? Because, I mean, end of the day, if nothing else, there's quite a rich seam of comedy, a lot of it, isn't it? Which is what obviously you're kind of mining.
Yeah, I think I just some of the interactions I just see are really awkward, and I think that awkwardness just lends itself so much to humor.
One of the other things I was going to ask you about is you've got the two areas that you mentioned earlier. You've got the day job, like as a professor, and then you've got native outdoors, which has been like, sounds like it's really progressed from the original genesis of it being an Instagram account. Do you find that because those two platforms or opportunities are so different, like you can consciously choose different ways of exploring issues for both of those, like for your day job and for native outdoors? Can you kind of look at it and think, okay, well, these are giving me opportunities to sort of look at different things in a different way and speak to different people?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, um, I think being in academia, a lot of I'm going to throw my colleagues under the bus a little bit here, but a lot of folks in academia don't spend a lot of time outside, and also just don't have many interactions with people that are outside of academia. So it becomes it becomes this like, I don't know, it becomes this hive mind in a way that I think is not productive to like trying to think, trying to find unique thoughts or insights about the challenging world that we live in. My work in that sphere is around natural resource policy and management with indigenous peoples. Like that's energy, that's climate change, that's recreation. And one of the things that I think, especially now that I've seen under Trump and the very populist time that we live in, is that there's a distrust of experts. There's a distrust of sort of knowledge that's being produced from academia. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that there needs to be that pushback on academia for, assuming that they know everything and anything about the world, which is not true. But, one of the things that I would say the academic side allows me to do is like, I have the training to like do technical policy analysis, understand these dynamics. But the part of the training that I did not get from that is how to communicate that to the broader world, how to make it relatable, how to make it actionable for people. And that's where I think the outdoor media side of that's really important. So we've made the Cody film in part of that is expressing indigenous worldviews on how they relate to the environment. That's very much of the thread of that film, the theme of that film came from an academic paper. It's called this indigenous peoplehood model. Basically that's where it came from. The other lane that
Right.
The other lane that I've worked on around that is we made a film called Welcome to Gwich'in, which is about oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, and the Gwich'in people's connection to caribou that calve there. That was a film that we made 2018. It got pushed out through Patagonia channels. It went to a bunch of film festivals. It eventually ended up in the hands of the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee here in the United States. And he watched it, was inspired, and he's like, you know what, we need this guy to come testify on, what he knows. And I think one of the things that I've really seen in the power of outdoor media and film is that it can be inspiring and it can change policy. Because, quite honestly, yeah, I could have easily written a paper about the Arctic Refuge, published it in a journal, and it would have sat for years if it was ever cited, and what eventually happened was a through line between creating this film, working with the community, creating this film, and then actual policy change. And I think that's been a line that I've had to draw on for some of my colleagues in the academy. And I remember one of the pieces of feedback was, I was like, wow, wonderful job on that testimony to Congress. They must have been really impressed by your body of literature that you've published. And I remember hearing that and just laughing, because it wasn't, that clear. That isn't what it led. That's not how it happened. So I guess at the end of the day, the two inform each other. I think there is a way to, film and media inspires my students, and the academic side can help make the stories a little deeper on the other side.
That's really interesting, because obviously I had Mario from Protect Our Winters on here a couple of months ago, I mean, it's a really great, it's a really obvious example of that, of like very consciously using that platform and that outlet to try and change policy. I mean, that's obviously what Protect Our Winters is. But yeah, like as you describe, it is a legitimate and very successful approach now, isn't it? To using to trying to affect change on that level. Perhaps not in Europe so much, I would say. I think it's much more localized. It's more of a local issue thing. Because I was just really struck by the ambition of that. Again, to take the Protect Our Winters example, like the campaign they put out during the election, which is something that I talked about on that episode. It was just, nothing less than we're going to try and swing some states. I mean, that's a pretty ambitious goal for to use the medium of action sports to do that. That is like a powerful bit of activism right there to try and achieve that, isn't it? So yeah, it's interesting. So that's that must be great then, the fact that you can like connect the two and see that happening. So is there anything to take that to its kind of logical next step then? Like, what are your ambitions for that approach?
I mean, I have my own, climbing and skiing objectives and things that I'm working towards. One would be to get those done. But I think in combining the two, I really want to be able to train students and other academics about how to communicate this knowledge in a way that's approachable and isn't just like sit in a journal article or behind a paywall, which most journals do. And how do you make this information relevant and actionable to the broader public? And it's totally possible. It takes work. It takes a special skill set. It takes being able to relate to other people and what they know and what they don't know, and but not at the end of the day just meeting people where they're at and not talking down to them. And that's it's almost like an unlearning of what we've been taught in this space. So I see there's an opportunity to transform academia, and one connecting the work and research that we do to a broader audience. I see it in my students, the students that come in and I share these films, or in this last class I had Forrest Shearer come and talk about his snowboard activism and climate change. I had Cody come and talk about what it meant to be a mentor to Connor now, in sort of supporting a Native athlete in that space, and it makes it real, it makes it relatable. And I think one of the things that I really like about doing my classes, a lot of the people that I'm bringing to my class don't have college educations, don't have those college degrees, and I actually like that. Because the smartest people in my own life have been people without degrees, like my grandfather, for example. He was a traditional medicine man and didn't know how to speak. He didn't speak English. He only spoke Navajo, and by Western standards at the time when he was growing up, he'd be considered an idiot. But the time I got to spend with him, he was just he knew so much about the mountains. He knew the mountains so well, and what I see in a lot of the pro athletes is almost this reflection of my grandfather and their deep knowledge of the mountains. And I want to share that with students, is that knowledge and expertise can manifest in different ways, and we have to have immense respect for people regardless of that, and recognize where those talents are and where they're at. And so that's been my sort of way of knocking down the academy from the inside. But on the outdoor side, I really see at least in supporting these athletes and the things that they're advocating for, with just being a resource for them, and like providing them with education and resources that further activates what they're trying to do. And that's kind of where that sort of intermediary place is where I really kind of getting it closer to making better activists, making more inspired students. I think at the end of the day is really what I'm trying to do with the two platforms.
Well, it's like you say, though, it's about communicating, isn't it? It's what it comes down to. Like, if you like, part of the challenge of activism, part of the challenge of solving problems, solving issues, especially issues on the scale that we face right now, is an ability to communicate them easily. And traditional leaders, as you alluded to earlier, aren't very good at that right now. They're good at polarizing people, and they're good at creating conflict. But in terms of resolution, you need to take your leaders and your good communicators where you find them right now, don't you? And as you say, like the field of academia is one sort of classic area where there's obviously the substance of the work can take place there, but often the way it's communicated is lacking, isn't it?
One of the ways that I've been I published a paper, I don't know, March. I had some, I think it was an Instagram story. I just shared the results, and like I had to artificially pump up my view count on the journal article. I had everyone, people that watch the story, basically go download it. But the other part of that was just making it relatable. And I think in that moment, I just realized, like, the way I can write as an academic is it's its own thing. I don't like writing like that. But it's sort of like, it's how you have to communicate in that space. The outlet that I have found, where I've found a lot of opportunity, is I've wrote a number of articles for the Alpinist, some on the expeditions that we've done. And in that way, it's been really like, the Alpinist is a really great magazine for writing, but that was, that's taken my sort of ability to, especially in the outdoor space, to communicate to a broader audience to another level. I mean, the editors there are phenomenal, and I definitely needed a lot of support as a recovering academic than writing into adventure writing. But I find the two are super complementary.
And tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing for the Honnold Foundation, because this is another kind of I mean, God, it sounds like you're wearing plenty of hats, but so what's your involvement there?
So I'm a board member, and in large part what I brought to the table was I worked a previous life. I worked in the Department of Energy here, and I worked in deploying renewable projects, wind and solar, largely, to native communities in Alaska and the lower 48. And I joined the foundation when we, basically had to vote to adopt the bylaws, like basically from the beginning. And so I was the first board member after Alex and Mari Birdwell. And, in large part, I brought two things to the table. One is I come from the communities that we serve. And I have an expertise in natural resource policy and renewable energy and grant making, and but also a connection to the outdoor industry as well. So it was kind of this, at the time it was like, very good. And so I've been working on supporting the organization on the grant program. So we gave out close to $1 million in grants, or a little bit above that this past year. But how to do an open call, solicit proposals, review the proposals, that sort of thing. But then also just strategic advice and like figuring out, how do we build our board capacity? Who do we bring on to support this mission further? And also just being a network for, potential grantees. And so yeah, that's been an amazing part of the job, and just at least in many ways, it feels like sort of the synergy between the two realities that I've been living in working in natural resource policy and then also the outdoor industry. It seems like this like natural fit for at least that work. So that's been fun. I mean, I always have to explain, it's the free solo guy. He gives a third of his income away to support solar projects. And people get it once I say that.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's certainly walking the walk, isn't he?
Yeah,
no doubt about that. So I mentioned earlier, and I you were posting about it on Insta. It is Deb Haaland, right? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Deb Haaland. Yep.
Was just appointed as Secretary of the Interior. Can you explain why that's so significant?
Yeah. I think I look at Deb. Deb is about my mom's age, and my mom, like Deb, we're some of the few Native women in our community that have achieved, higher education degrees, and a lot of that's just, no opportunities, or not the same opportunities, institutions that were pretty toxic to them as people. My mom talked about, she went to, she was in a boarding school, and like one of the things that would happen there is that if they spoke Navajo, they would get their mouth washed out with soap. And that was part to just try to erase their culture. And so, I think despite that,
Wow.
that sort of history, to see, Deb especially be able to, one, be elected, and then two, be selected to be the Secretary of Interior, which is a massive, massive agency within the federal government. I mean, it oversees, a huge chunk of the federal public lands, national parks. But the other element of that is that it also oversees things like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is this official entity that, is a sort of liaison between the U.S. government and Native nations. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that backstory is something that a lot of people don't realize, where people are coming from and how much higher of a mountain it was to climb for, women like Deb and my mom. But I think the other thing is, it gives some, hopefully, an opening in thinking about how do we do, federal Indian policy different. How do we actually make it where it is a government to government relationship, and not just the federal government telling Native nations what to do or what not to do. And, I think, there's a lot of, support for her candidacy. And there's also, she wasn't the only Native person in the running. And I think, that, I almost see that as a success, is that she wasn't the only Native person, but she was definitely the one that had the best qualifications for the job. And that almost feels like a win, to be able to have a choice. And it gives me hope, at least in what could be possible. But I think one of the things that I'm beginning to shift gears and think about now is, like, having worked in the federal government and having worked on that side of the house, one of the things that I then hope people understand is that things are not going to change as quickly as they want them to. And there's going to be some disappointment with how slow federal policy takes to implement, and how long and how many setbacks there are. And it's like turning an aircraft carrier. I don't know how else to explain it. And it just takes a lot of work. And I think there's going to be, especially in the activist community and the Native community, I'm worried that people are going to be then let down with that progress. And I hope it doesn't translate into saying that, Deb Haaland let us down or whatever. It's just, she's working within a system that just takes a lot to change. And I think some of my work in the next few years is just going to be, communicating and articulating that, we need to give her the runway to be successful, because she has she has to undo a lot of terrible policies, which is its own lengthy process, and then implementing new ones, which is its own lengthy process. It takes time, and we have to be patient, but we have to continue to show up like we have been.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the fact so the symbolism of the appointment is pretty evident. Is that do you feel hopeful that it will be able to create lasting change and impact?
I think the symbolism of the appointment is a lasting change and impact that's important. I think there will be things like the return of the Bears Ears National Monument that will be very important. I think there will be other substantive changes towards tribes that will be very different. I don't know what there will be right now, but Yeah, I think there will be. I just know that Deb is going to get a lot of unfair scrutiny and sort of people that don't agree with her politics breathing down her back because she is a woman and she is a Native woman too. And so, I hope at the end of the day, like one of the things that I'm just really, she's going to choose a good team. I know this. And yeah, I think to say what will change and what will happen, I mean, it's going to be like minutia of changing federal lease rates on Indian lands and, having a different process for, environmental review of cultural resources. I mean, just these little like tweaks and changes. In terms of large substantive change, that's going to have to come from Congress because at the end of the day, these agencies they can only operate within the sort of sandbox that Congress has created for them. And so, the large changes on things like co-management of federal lands at the end of the day, like between indigenous peoples and the federal government, that's going to have to come from an act of Congress. And I think that's where I kind of see, large sweeping transformations. It really depends on what happens in January with our last set of elections in Georgia. But I'm hopeful. I know there's some like tweaky changes within the Department of Energy or Department of Interior that will make really big changes for tribes as well. But they might not be as flashy as appointing her. But she will be leading those changes as well.
As I think I mentioned to you over the chats we've been having, this, the theme of this is activism, and a question I quite often ask guests who, have established a career for themselves in their own space, like, and are able to influence the issues that are important to them is, what advice would you have for somebody listening to this who is, inspired but doesn't really know where to start?
The way to make it sustainable in the long term is that activism can easily be a path to burnout. And I've seen that in a lot of my friends and colleagues. I've definitely experienced some of that myself from time to time. But I think what keeps it going for me is it's personal, it's related to my own life, and it's something that's just, I mean, it's just like, it's something that intersects with what I'm doing every day. And so like, I'm spending time outside every day. And so like, why would I not spend time on advocating for the protection of these spaces in addition to doing this? I mean, it's very much like, it doesn't feel separate from my life in that way, but it's also associated with something that like gives me pleasure, gives me happiness. And, I guess in terms of that cortisol and dopamine and serotonin, I always like to say they kind of mellow each other out when, we're talking about climate change and then we go skiing. Like it's like, but I would say at the end of the day, that's a big one. And the other was, in doing activist work and in being in the space, criticism and negative feedback are inevitable. And, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And that feedback, at the end of the day, you can find more people that are supporting what you're doing than are against. And, it's just surrounding yourself with folks that are in that support network is really, at the end of the day, what's gotten me through.
So there you go. That was me and Len, and I hope you enjoyed it. I've put Len's links in the description of this podcast, but you can find him at Len Necefer at Instagram and Natives Outdoors. And while you're there, make sure you check out that episode of Cody Townsend's The 50 I mentioned, which is really, really great. That series also is great. You can also find my profile on Instagram at We Look Sideways. There we go. Thanks for listening and for supporting Type 2 generally. I release new episodes of Type 2 every month or so through my usual Looking Sideways channel. You can subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the usual podcast purveyors. You can also head over to my website, www.wearelookingsideways.com, where you'll find the entire Type 2 back catalogue and the entire archive of my main Looking Sideways podcast too. I'm almost at 150 episodes with some of the biggest names in action sports and other related endeavours, so I'm pretty sure you'll find some stuff you'll be interested in there. All right. Nice one. Thanks for listening. See you next time.